Imagine walking across a quiet Viking farm on an ordinary summer morning. Nothing around you suggests that this remote corner of Scandinavia was once connected to some of the richest civilizations on Earth. Then, beneath the floor of a simple wooden house, archaeologists uncover a small silver coin. They carefully brush away the soil, expecting to find a familiar Viking artifact. Instead, they discover an inscription written in Arabic. At first, it seems impossible. The Vikings never conquered Baghdad. They never ruled the Islamic world. They never built an empire stretching from the Middle East to Northern Europe. Yet discoveries like this are not rare. Over the last century, archaeologists have recovered hundreds of thousands of Islamic silver coins across Scandinavia, hidden inside farms, buried in treasure hoards, and placed in graves more than 1,000 years ago. Every discovery points toward the same mystery. How did so much wealth travel so far north? Most people believe they already know the answer. The Vikings became rich because they raided Europe. It is one of history's most familiar stories. Longships appear through the morning mist, warriors storm ashore, monasteries are stripped of their treasures before the attackers disappear beyond the horizon. Those events were real, and they helped create the fearsome reputation that still surrounds the Viking Age today. But there is one problem with that explanation. A monastery could only be plundered once. A town emptied of its wealth became a far less valuable target the following year. Every expedition demanded months of preparation, skilled crews, strong ships, food, supplies, and the willingness to risk everything against storms, disease, or armed resistance. Even a successful raid offered no guarantee that the next voyage would end the same way. Raiding could produce spectacular rewards, but it could never provide the stable foundation needed to enrich an entire civilization for generations. Yet, that is exactly what happened. During the Viking Age, Scandinavia grew steadily wealthier. Small coastal settlements expanded into thriving trading towns. Foreign luxury goods began appearing in places where they seemed almost impossible to explain. Silver flowed into the north in astonishing quantities, while merchants returned with silk, glass, jewelry, and other valuable goods from lands most people in medieval Europe would never see. The deeper historians looked, the more obvious the pattern became. The greatest Viking fortunes were not built in a single day of violence. They were built over decades by people who understood something far more valuable than conquest. Instead of controlling kingdoms, they learned how to control the movement of wealth itself. That forgotten network would eventually connect Scandinavia with Constantinople, the Abbasid Caliphate, Eastern Europe, and the kingdoms of the West, creating one of the most remarkable economic systems of the early medieval world. And like every great story, it all began with a single advantage that almost nobody else possessed. The answer was never hidden inside a monastery. It was hidden in the map. To most people living in early medieval Europe, rivers were obstacles. They separated kingdoms, slowed armies, and forced merchants onto long, dangerous roads. But the Vikings looked at the same landscape and saw something entirely different. Every river was another road. Every lake became another crossroads. Every narrow stretch of water offered another chance to reach places that larger ships could never approach. That simple idea changed everything. The Viking longship was not remarkable because it was the fastest vessel of its age. Its true strength was freedom. It could survive rough seas, glide through shallow rivers, and even be dragged across short strips of land before continuing into another waterway. A journey that seemed impossible to everyone else suddenly became achievable. Instead of stopping where the river ended, the Vikings simply carried their ships to the next one and kept moving. Little by little, an extraordinary network began to emerge. A voyage could begin in Scandinavia, cross the Baltic Sea, reach Staraya Ladoga, continue toward Novgorod, follow the Volga through the heart of Eastern Europe, and eventually connect with markets that stretched toward the Caspian Sea and the Abbasid Caliphate. It was not one long road, but hundreds of waterways joined together like the branches of a living tree. Every successful expedition made the network stronger, while every returning crew carried home new knowledge about rivers, ports, languages, and distant rulers. These journeys demanded patience as much as courage. Crews spent months away from home, rowing against strong currents, repairing damaged ships, and pulling heavy vessels across muddy portages where no river existed. They crossed territories controlled by unfamiliar peoples, negotiated with local leaders, and accepted that storms, disease, or a single mistake could end the expedition forever. Unlike a raid, there was no quick victory waiting at the end of the journey. Wealth had to be earned one exchange at a time. The farther south they traveled, the more valuable their cargo became. Northern Europe possessed resources that were difficult to obtain elsewhere. Thick furs, beeswax, honey, walrus ivory, and other northern products attracted merchants from distant civilizations. In return, Viking traders acquired silk woven in Byzantine workshops, finely crafted glass, elegant jewelry, rare spices, and above all, silver. Not dozens of coins, not hundreds, but a steady flow of precious metal that continued reaching Scandinavia year after year. For the first time, wealth no longer depended on what could be taken by force. It depended on keeping the network alive. The more rivers the Vikings explored, the more markets they reached, the more silver returned to the north. Before long, the ships that had once carried warriors toward the shores of Europe were carrying something far more valuable: opportunity. And as the network continued expanding, it began transporting another kind of cargo that revealed the darkest side of Viking commerce. As the Viking trading network expanded, the cargo returning to Scandinavia became more valuable with every successful expedition. Northern merchants carried furs from dense forests, beeswax gathered from wild hives, honey, walrus ivory, and other resources that were abundant in the north but highly prized elsewhere. In distant markets, those goods were exchanged for silver, silk, fine glass, jewelry, spices, and luxury items that few people in Scandinavia had ever seen. Every completed journey increased both experience and profit, encouraging even more ambitious expeditions the following season. Yet one of the most profitable commodities moving through these routes was neither silver nor silk. It was people. Captives taken during raids in Britain, Ireland, Francia, and Eastern Europe became part of a vast slave trade that reached far beyond Scandinavia. Strong laborers, skilled craftsmen, women, and children were transported along the same rivers that carried valuable merchandise, eventually reaching markets connected to Byzantium and the Islamic world. It is an uncomfortable reality, but one that cannot be ignored. Human lives became another commodity within a trading system that stretched across thousands of kilometers. This reveals something many people misunderstand about the Viking economy. The Vikings were not simply sailing south with empty ships, hoping to return with stolen treasure. Successful expeditions were carefully planned long before they left home. Cargo was loaded in Scandinavia, exchanged in one market, replaced with goods of even greater value in another, and eventually carried back through the same network. Profit was created at every stage of the journey. Every exchange made the remaining cargo more valuable than it had been only days before. At the center of this system stood silver. Archaeologists have uncovered extraordinary numbers of Islamic silver dirhams across Scandinavia, but many of those coins were never used as money in the modern sense. Instead, they were deliberately cut into smaller pieces and traded according to their weight. Viking merchants often carried small folding balances wherever they traveled, weighing fragments of silver during negotiations rather than counting individual coins. In a world where dozens of kingdoms issued different currencies, the value of pure silver was understood almost everywhere. That simple system gave Viking merchants a remarkable advantage. They could travel between cultures, languages, and political borders without depending on the authority of any single king. As long as the silver was genuine, business could continue. One successful expedition financed another. More ships entered the trade routes, more settlements grew into prosperous towns, wealth spread across Scandinavia with a speed that would have seemed impossible only a few generations earlier. By now, it might seem that trade alone explains the extraordinary fortunes of the Viking Age. But even this vast commercial network tells only part of the story. Some of the greatest fortunes in Scandinavia were earned without buying or selling a single piece of cargo. Trade transformed Scandinavia, but it was never the only force behind Viking prosperity. If commerce alone explained their success, historians would still struggle to understand the extraordinary amount of silver that continued flowing into the Norse century after century. The real strength of the Viking economy lay in its diversity. Wealth arrived from several directions at once, allowing one source of income to support another until they formed a system that was remarkably resilient for its time. One of the most unusual parts of that system emerged along the shores of England. As Viking fleets appeared with increasing frequency, English rulers faced an impossible dilemma. Defending every monastery, every coastal settlement, and every trading town demanded resources they simply did not possess. Even when an army succeeded in driving one fleet away, another often appeared somewhere else only weeks later. Gradually, several kings reached a different conclusion. Instead of risking another costly campaign, they offered silver in exchange for peace. Those payments became known as Danegeld. At first, they were intended as temporary solutions, but over time they grew into enormous transfers of wealth. Rather than occupying entire kingdoms and maintaining expensive armies, Viking leaders discovered that their reputation alone could produce remarkable profits. Fear became a political tool, and diplomacy often generated greater rewards than conquest. In many cases, accepting silver and sailing away proved far more profitable than attempting to rule unfamiliar territory for years. While silver flowed from the west, another opportunity was waiting in the east. Beyond the rivers of Eastern Europe stood Constantinople, the magnificent capital of the Byzantine Empire. Few cities in the medieval world could rival its wealth, and its emperors sought experienced Scandinavian warriors to serve in the elite Varangian Guard. These men were trusted with protecting the emperor himself, a responsibility rewarded with generous salaries, valuable gifts, and opportunities unavailable anywhere in Northern Europe. Many of those warriors eventually returned home, carrying fortunes earned through years of loyal service. They brought silver, beautifully crafted weapons, luxurious clothing, fine jewelry, and knowledge gathered from one of the greatest cities on earth. Their wealth did not remain locked away. It was invested in land, ships, businesses, and new trading ventures that strengthened local communities and encouraged even greater prosperity throughout Scandinavia. When all of these pieces are viewed together, a completely different picture begins to emerge. Trade connected distant markets. Danegeld redirected the wealth of kingdoms. Service in Byzantium opened the doors of one of history's richest empires. Each source supported the others, creating an economy that continued growing long after individual raids had ended. By the end of the Viking Age, Scandinavia had become far more than a homeland of explorers and warriors. It had become the center of one of the most remarkable economic networks in medieval Europe. Only one final question remains. What does that forgotten network tell us about the true legacy of the Vikings? More than 1,000 years have passed since the last Viking longship disappeared beyond the horizon. Yet one idea has survived almost unchanged. Ask someone why the Vikings became rich, and the answer will almost always begin with raids. It is the story repeated in documentaries, films, novels, and classrooms. Fierce warriors crossed the sea, plundered monasteries, filled their ships with treasure, and returned home as wealthy men. It is an unforgettable image. It is also only part of the truth. The archaeological evidence tells a far more fascinating story. Beneath Scandinavian fields lie Arabic silver coins minted in distant Islamic cities. Viking graves contain Byzantine silk, foreign glass, beautifully crafted jewelry, and objects that had traveled thousands of kilometers before reaching the north. Trading towns such as Hedeby, Borca, Dublin, and Staraya Ladoga reveal communities filled with merchants, craftsmen, travelers, and goods arriving from every direction. None of these discoveries points toward a civilization living only from plunder. Instead, they reveal a society deeply connected to the wider medieval world through commerce, diplomacy, exploration, and long-distance exchange. That may be the greatest lesson the Vikings left behind. They understood that lasting prosperity could never depend on a single source of wealth. Raiding opened doors, but trade kept those doors open. Rivers connected distant markets. Silver financed new expeditions. Successful merchants invested in larger ships and stronger trading centers. Warriors returned from Byzantium with fortunes earned through service rather than conquest. Every successful voyage strengthened the next one, allowing the entire system to grow steadily across generations instead of collapsing after a few victorious campaigns. Perhaps that is why Viking influence spread so far beyond Scandinavia. They were never simply sailors searching for treasure, nor were they only warriors seeking glory. They became explorers, merchants, diplomats, craftsmen, settlers, and entrepreneurs who understood how to profit from movement itself. While many kingdoms measured power by the amount of land they controlled, the Vikings discovered that controlling routes could be even more valuable than controlling borders. In many ways, they were building something that feels surprisingly modern, a network where information, goods, people, and wealth moved constantly between distant regions, a network where every successful connection created another opportunity, and every new opportunity made the entire system stronger. Their ships did more than cross seas. They linked economies that had once existed almost entirely apart from one another. That is why the story of Viking wealth deserves to be told differently. The greatest fortunes of the Viking Age were not created during a single raid, and they were not hidden inside the walls of conquered monasteries. They were built patiently through rivers that became highways, markets that became gateways, and partnerships that crossed languages, religions, and continents. The Vikings certainly knew how to take wealth, but their greatest achievement was learning how to make wealth move. That forgotten network transformed Scandinavia, connected much of the known world, and became one of the most extraordinary economic systems of the early medieval age. And that is how the Vikings became rich without conquering Europe.